The Crooked Path of Progress in Cognitive Linguistics. Sidney M. Lamb. Abstract. This paper briefly reviews the history of stratificational theory, here called cognitive linguistics, since it aims to provide a model of the information system that enables a person to speak his language. The theory began in the mid-50s with a three-stratum model, and it added a fourth stratum, above the classical morphemic level, in 1961. During the 60s a series of revisions occurred, not all of which involved direct progress. The paper concludes with a brief introduction to the current model, which has 3 grammatical strata and 1 phonological stratum for the language proper, plus a conceptual system containing all of the individual's knowledge, other than his language. Orientation. In the early 60s, linguistic theoreticians spent a lot of their energy trying to persuade others that they were right. The most vociferous of such persuaders were the transformationalists, and they won quite a few converts. But many remained unpersuaded, or only partly persuaded. And it appears that during the late 60s, as different factions developed within the transformational school, a degree of tolerance, or perhaps it was just resignation, developed, and more linguists decided that they could go on living even if others held different points of view. Now, for a linguist to allow others to disagree with him doesn't necessarily mean that he has decided to tolerate stubbornness, stupidity, or ignorance. Perhaps some linguists have been realizing that different objectives. From Monograph Series on Languages and Linguistics 24.99 to 123. Reprinted by permission. For different formulations, so that the current variety of linguistic theories is quite acceptable as the reasonable outcome of the variety of objectives being pursued by differently motivated linguists. This point was first brought home to me by Halliday's paper Syntax and the Consumer, presented at the first Georgetown Roundtable in which I participated, in 1964. His point was simply that you will get different syntactic theories for different purposes. It has been common during the past decade to designate linguistic theories on the basis of some important feature of their descriptive apparatus. We have tagmemics, which makes use of tagmemes, transformational grammar, in which transformational rules play an important role, systemic grammar, which makes use of a device for which the technical term within that theory is system, stratificational grammar, which is stratified. Now, if it is correct, as I just suggested, that these different theories have resulted from different aims, then we might alternati /ely designate them in accordance with these aims in order to clarify the situation and strengthen our tolerance for one another's differing formulations. Thus, systemic grammar might be called functional grammar, since its approach was arrived at through a concern with the communicative functions of linguistic choices made by the speaker. Stratificational grammar can be called cognitive linguistics, since it is concerned with representing the speaker's internal information system, which makes it possible for him to speak his language and to understand utterances received from others. I leave it to Pike and Smith, respectively, to designate what alternative names might be applied to tagmemics and aspectual theory. For transformational grammar, the appropriate alternative term is already in use. It may properly be called generative grammar, or generative linguistics, as its aim is to provide a system of rules which can generate all the sentences of a language and only those. Generative linguistics. A few years ago I would have thought it inappropriate for the term generative to be assigned just to the transformational school, because I considered that stratificational theory, among others, also had a generative aim. I did not state the aim in the same way for stratificational theory, since it seemed to me, following Hjelmslev, that the more sensible objective was to generate the texts of the language, including those longer than sentences. But this is of course also a basically generative aim. Since other schools of thought in linguistics have had generative aims, one could more accurately characterize transformational generative grammar as that which attempts to generate by the use of a particular notational system of production rules borrowed from symbolic logic. Gleason has suggested that it be called rescriptive grammar. But the simple designation generative linguistics is not inappropriate, since this theory more than any of the others tends to let other aims be subordinate to the overriding generative objective. But I must add to this that for the current version of stratificational theory the term generative would not be correctly applied in any case, that is. The term generative stratificational grammar suggested by Carl Teeter in a recent talk to the Yale Linguistics Club, entitled Generative Bloomfieldian Grammar, is a misnomer as applied to current stratificational theory. Some time ago I rejected as a practical impossibility the goal of generating all the texts of a language and only those, and I proposed that as an alternative we need a relative aim, Lamb 1966 A541-543. That is, we want a grammar that generates as many texts as possible, rather than all the texts, while generating as few as possible spurious texts. Since the absolute goal is impossible, we would use this relative standard to choose between two competing grammars. But my current position goes further than this and rejects the generative goal as unrealistic even as a theoretical possibility, since that goal presupposes that there is such a thing as the set of grammatical sentences as a well-defined set. But such a well-defined set does not exist, cf. Hockett. 1968b, in any real language, the boundary between what is grammatical and what is not is constantly shifting. And you can't avoid the problem even by assuming that you are stopping the language at a point in time in order to define the set of sentences at that point, since at any point of time there are semi-grammatical sentences. The constant flux of a real language entails that new grammatical devices are gradually coming into use, along with new idioms and the like, while others are gradually withering. Here one is dealing with continuous rather than discrete phenomena. The boundary between grammatical and ungrammatical is a continuum, not a sharp boundary. To try to enumerate the sentences of a language even at a point in time is like trying to enumerate the leaves on a tree at a point of time in June. How far formed does a newly forming leaf have to be to count as a leaf? At what point does a bug-eaten leaf cease to be a leaf? Thus I for one am happy to leave the term generative as an exclusive designation for the transformationalist school. In any case, it appears to be the only school that attaches such overriding importance to the generative aim. Cognitive linguistics. The other term that calls for comment is cognitive linguistics, which I propose as a designation for that branch of linguistic inquiry which aims at characterizing the speaker's internal information system that makes it possible for him to speak his language and to understand utterances received from others. Is it appropriate that this term should accurately only to what has been known as stratificational theory? The reason I say yes is that the basic requirement which a linguistic theory must meet to qualify for this term is that it take account of the basic fact about human beings who know a language. That fact is that they are able to speak it, and they are able to understand sentences received from other speakers. In short, they are able to perform. Their knowledge of their language, their internal linguistic information system, is a competence to perform. That knowledge is capable of being used by them for speaking and understanding. Thus any linguistic theory qualifies as cognitive linguistics, which aims to provide an account of a language that can be used as a basis for a performance model. As far as I know, stratificational theory is the only one that qualifies at present, cf. Reich 1967, but we would be delighted to welcome linguists from other backgrounds to this fascinating and fertile area, if they can suitably modify their theories so that they can confront the fundamental fact that must be dealt with. My strong suspicion is that any such modifications will inevitably be in the direction of stratificational theory. Indeed, we have already seen moves of some transformationalists in this direction, and we welcome further such revisions. 7. Background and beginnings. The developments of the 60s in cognitive linguistics cover almost the entire history of this theory. A preliminary model existed by the end of the 50s, but it had not yet been publicly announced, nor had the term stratificational been used for it, until 1961. Various revisions and additions were made during the 60s, as hypotheses were formulated and tested, and as attempts were made to increase the scope of data accounted for. And one might perhaps be justified in saying that by 1970 the theory was no longer merely programmatic but actually existed, so that as the 70s begin it has finally become sufficiently developed to be proposed seriously as a relatively coherent theory of language. The background. This brief review of developments must begin with the acknowledgement that cognitive linguistics did not originate out of the blue but was built upon the admirable work of its predecessors, of whom I should mention particularly Nida, Hockett, Hjelmslev, and Chomsky. These theorists of course in turn built upon earlier work, including that of Bloomfield, Sapir, Saussure, and others, and the list of those who influenced Bloomfield goes all the way back to Pahniny. Now the Neo-Bloomfieldian model I had been taught as a graduate student in the early 50s had two structural levels, phonemic and morphemic, cf. Needham 1949, Hockett 1954. A morpheme had allomorphs or might have just one morph, and a morph was composed of phonemes. Allomorphs might be either morphologically conditioned or phonologically conditioned, and many alternations of the latter type were economically described by means of morphophonemic rules, but such rules were generally not considered to have any structural status, as the structural fact was that the morpheme had allomorphs. The morphophonemic rule was just a descriptive device for summarizing numerous statements specifying phonologically constituent allomorphs. Stage I. My first major disillusionment with this Neo-Bloomfieldian model came when I tried to apply it to Manaki, a Uto-Aztecan language of California I was attempting to describe. Despite what I had been taught, I kept finding evidence indicating that there was another level of structure between the morphemic and phonemic levels. It wasn't economical to go from morphemes to phonemic forms in just one step. Rather, it was evident that there was one level of alternation involving morpheme-sized units, with morphological conditioning environments, and below it a level of phonologically conditioned alternation among phonological units. I therefore concluded that there was an intermediate level between the morphemic and phonemic levels of Neo-Bloomfieldian linguistics. I called it, at this time, the morphophonemic level. Later it got renamed see below. I also rejected the commonly held notion of the morpheme as a class of allomorphs in favor of the concept of the morpheme as an element existing on a different realizational level from that of its allomorphs. In other words, the allomorphs were the realizations of the morpheme rather than its members. These allomorphs were composed of morphophonemes. The conditioning environments for alternations among allomorphs were morphological. Then morphophonemes were realized as phonemes, which were composed of phonological components, and alternations at this level were conditioned by morphophonemic environments. This treatment puts the morphophonemic rule into a different status than it had before, in two ways. First, it was a statement of realization, just like that between morphemes and allomorphs, or between phonemes and allophones, rather than a process statement. Second, it was given a structural status and not just considered a convenient descriptive device for summarizing statements about allomorphs. Table 1. Some Manaki verb stems gloss singular agent plural agent to wander ni mu to sit q ti k I to stand ni q no to lie happy q api. This three-level model, departing from the earlier two-level view, might be taken as the beginning of stratificational grammar, since it is hardly fitting to call a system stratified if it has only two crata. The term stratum and the term stratificational were not used in connection with it, however, until the 60s. The three-level model was first proposed at a meeting of the linguistics group at Berkeley in 1957, and it was used in my dissertation, completed in the same year. I was not yet ready to present it more publicly. While it had dealt with one serious defect of Neo-Bloomfieldian grammar, this original stratificational model remained less than completely satisfying in that it failed to deal with certain phenomena which suggested that there must be further structure above the morphemic level. For example, Manaki has some verb stems which come in semantically related pairs. One for singular agent, one for plural agent in each pair, otherwise having the same meaning. These are shown in Table 1. They are not to be compared with go, when I, or good, het I, of English, since the monarchy stems are contrastive in identical morphological environments. Other examples pointing to the possible existence of a higher level appeared at about the same time in Chomsky's Syntactic Structures, 1957, for example the shooting of the hunters and the active-passive relationship. But the device which Chomsky, following his teacher Harris, proposed for dealing with these data, namely the now famous transformational rule, was unacceptable to me since it was of Peirce's caret formulation, involving mutation of forms on the same level, and while such a formulation could apparently account for the primary data, it was not realistic as applied to encoding and decoding. Rather, these and similar data made me suspect that there might be some additional level of structure above the classical morphemic level, but I didn't get around to exploring this possibility until the beginning of the 60s. Two developments of the 60s cognitive linguistics entered the 60s with exploration leading to the conclusion that there was indeed a higher level, and it adopted the name stratificational grammar. It then went through a series of refinements and revisions, not all of which, as we can now see, represented actual progress. That is why I call the path a crooked one. Following Ila Fleming, 1969, we may recognize three stages of development during the 60s. Stages 2, 3, and 4. Each of these stages worked with a particular cognitive model of language, and minor model changes occurred within each stage. Ignoring these minor model changes, we may designate the models as Model 2, Model 3, and Model 4, using the same numbers as for the stages in which they were used. Stage 2. Now of course it wouldn't have to be the case that an additional level of structure would be related to its lower neighbor in the same way that the morphemic is to the morphophonemic, and so forth, but examination of the evidence indicated that this was indeed the case, for the essential properties. Thus, for example, calling the higher level the sememic, we may say, with reference to Table 1, that monarchy has a sememe to wander, which is realized morphemically as either ni or mu depending on whether it is occurring with singular or plural agent. Similarly, we can account for the ambiguity in the shooting of the hunters by recognizing that of is the ambiguous realization of either the agent sememe or the goal sememe, both of which have other, but differing, realizations, Lamb. 1964 A72-3. There is a nice parallel here, between transformations and morphophonemic rewrite rules. The earlier treatments of morphophonemic alternations used process or mutation rules, applying to basic phonemes to yield actually occurring phonemes. Neo-Bloomfieldians rejected the structural validity of such rules because they were process rules applying to units of one level to yield units of the same level in a fictional time span. They therefore lacked what we may now call cognitive reality. Other linguists found these process formulations so useful, since they could summarize in one statement the alternation of indefinitely many allomorphs, that they went ahead and used them and said, in effect, let cognitive reality be hanged, I want economy. Now the stratificational answer is to get both the economy and the cognitive reality, by setting up the morphophoneme rule as a realizational phenomenon rather than a process. Thus instead of saying that M is replaced by W intervocalically, we say that there is a higher level element, a morphophoneme, which has alternate realization /M/N/W/, of which the latter occurs intervocalically, the former elsewhere. Now we find a similar situation higher in the linguistic structure. And again the descriptive device which occurred first historically was a process formulation, developed by Harris and adopted by Chomsky, in this case called the transformation. Many linguists rejected the transformation on grounds which we may summarize by saying that it is cognitively unrealistic. Others said, in effect, cognitive reality be hanged, look at all the things we can do with transformations. And again the resolution of the conflict is to recognize that we are actually dealing with a higher level and with alternative realizations of the higher level entities, the relationship being that of _realization rather than transformation. In other words, we can account for the data treated by Chomsky and his followers without giving up cognitive reality. This second model was the first one I considered ready for public presentation. It was proposed in a paper read at the Christmas meeting of the Linguistic Society in 1961, in which it was argued that we must recognize a stratum between the classical morphemic and phonemic levels as well as a fourth stratum above the classical morphemic. It was further argued that the relationship between different such levels was different from the class member relationship and the process relationship, with which it had generally been confused, and the term stratum was proposed for a realization Ally-defined level. Hockett, 1961, had independently arrived at the same term at about the same time. A short time later, Chomsky brought forth his revised conception, in which there was a deep structure and which no longer had any optional meaning-bearing transformations. This D-EP structure, the term is from Hockett 1958:246-52, comes partway toward the sememic stratum, but only partway, for the rules relating deep structure to surface structure were still transformations, process rules which perform operations on some items while leaving others unchanged. The consequence is that a deep structure so formulated is really a selection of various surface features and is not in fact very deep. An informally published outline of stratificational grammar appeared in 1962, but the first formal published presentations did not appear until 2 years later, Gleason 1964, Lamb 1964a, 1964b. Two of the three papers which then appeared owe their existence to the Georgetown Round Table. A further step taken during Stage 2 was an analysis of the relationship of realization into a number of more elementary relationships, which were called diversification, neutralization, zero realization, empty realization, composite realization, portmanteau realization, and anaxis, Lamb 1964a. In fact, it was this analysis which was used to establish that the newly added sememic stratum was indeed another stratum, related to the next lower one in the same way that the more familiar strata are related to their lower neighbors. In the early part of Stage 2 it was not clear whether each stratum had a tactics, but by 1963 it was apparent that there were indeed 4 independent tactic patterns. The problem of specifying the details of the interconnection of the tactic patterns with realizational elements, however, remained unsolved. Terminological problems. It has always seemed wise to me for any terminology to stick as closely as possible to established traditions. Now, if the tradition has terms for only 2 levels, and if some of these are used ambiguously or vaguely, then something must be added, but one does best to add as little as possible, and then in keeping with tradition as much as possible. Figure 1. The classical model phonemic component, phonetic component, morpheme, phoneme, alio, morph, alio, phone. Figure 2. Model IA, morphologically conditioned alternation. B, C, phonologically conditioned alternation, to be described as, C, realization of morphophonemes by phonemes. Morpheme 2, a morphophoneme, morpheme CIB, phonemic phoneme, morph component, I, phonetic _phi ne component. The terminology of the classical structural tradition can be represented as in Figure 1, in which the vertical dimension represents realization while the horizontal represents composition, cf. Hockett 1961. Registered. For example, a morph is composed of phonemes and is a realization of a morpheme. Using the same diagramming conventions, we may represent the relationships among the units of stage I as in Figure 2. In this figure the dotted lines represent relationships which, while they exist, need not be explicitly described in the grammar, since they are automatically, and more simply, defined by the specification of the solid line relationships. This model is described as having 3 strata since the lowest level, the phonetic, was not considered to be part of the linguistic structure. The terms given as morpheme I and morpheme 2 furnish our first example of a terminological problem. The tradition provides only one term for 2 structural units which must be distinguished. Of these, morpheme 2 is closer to the morpheme of the 50s, but morpheme I is closer to Bloomfield's morpheme, which was described as composed of phonemes. Those not familiar with the history of stratificational theory need not be bothered now with a discussion of what was done with the terminology at stage I, since we get a better idea of what is needed if we go directly to stage 2, figure 3. Figure 3. Model 2 T6 Semotactics 110 Phonetic Component Lexotactics or Morphotactics Phonotactics 111 R6 1020. Here we have the term morpheme for morpheme I of figure 2, and lexeme for morpheme 2. The term lexeme is formed with a suffix used for the elementary unit of each stratum, so it means elementary unit of the lexemic stratum or component of a lexeme. Similarly, the morphon is a component of a morpheme, and the term may also be considered a shortening of morph, off, on, eme. Thus we add only one suffix to the terminology rather than a series of additional terms. The term lexeme is here used in roughly the sense it already had in the tradition extending from Werf, 1938, to Conklin, 1962, cf. Lamb 1966a, 567-9. And the term sememe has an even longer tradition, having been used not only by Bloomfield but also by the Swedish linguist Adolf Norén, who in the early part of the century proposed that a linguistic structure has three levels, phonemic, morphemic, and sememic, with units which he called the phoneme, the morpheme and the sememe, Norén 1903-18, Polyak 1923. In figure 3 the minimal units, phonon, morphon, etc., are placed to the left of the top of the appropriate vertical lines rather than right at the intersections as in the earlier figures. This calls attention to the fact that the minimal unit of each stratum does not always coincide with the unit having a realization on the next lower stratum. For example, the morpheme second is the realization of the combination of lexemes 2 and th, entering into portmanteau realization, Lamb 1964a. The vertical lines are placed to show some average estimated quantitative relationships for a typical language. For example, according to the rough estimate, there are about 5 morphons in the average morpheme. Semen is placed rather far to the left of the vertical line since it was considered at this time that there was an extensive amount of portmanteau realization at this level, Lamb 1966 e carad. Another feature of figure 3 is that the horizontal lines extend to the right of the emic units, e.g. morpheme. The reason is that there are structurally significant combinations of these units, specified by the tactics of each stratum. Stage 3. The next step was to examine the interconnections among the 7 relationships which are collectively involved in the difference between one stratum and the next. Upon such examination it soon became apparent that they are systematically ordered with respect to one another, so that a full stratum of difference, say from lexemes to morphons, consists of several little steps rather than just one big one with all the realizational relationships in a single bundle. In part this situation had already been recognized in stage 2, in that morphemes were present at a level intermediate between lexemes and morphons, and figure 3 also separates out portmanteau realization. But in stage 3 further separation of the relation ships was recognized, resulting in the scheme shown in figure 4, Lamb 1965. Later work showed that this is not exactly the right way to sort them out, but if this was not a step straight ahead, at least the path was moving diagonally forward at this point. In this scheme there are 2 intermediate levels between the lexeme and the morphon, and again we have a terminological problem in that a distinction is drawn between 2 units both of which are like the former morpheme. It seemed easiest to call them simply the basic morpheme and the actual or realized morpheme. The simple term morpheme could be used for short for the latter. Figure 4. Model 3a, Anat axis, 0 realization, empty realization B, diversification, neutralization, portmanteau realization, 0 realization C, Composite realization basic C-meme C Semen C-meme basic lexeme BC lexin lexeme semotactics lexotasics basic morpheme C morpheme basic phoneme phonon phoneme morphotactics phonotactics. With the recognition of the new intermediate step, it was no longer sufficient to say that the linguistic system just consisted of strata together with realizational relationships separating them. Rather, it became necessary to recognize the stratal system, a complex structure of which the stratum was just one part. Thus the morphemic stratal system included the morphons, morphemes, basic morphemes, together with their interrelationships, plus the morphotactics. The level of the morphons and morphemes could be called the morphemic stratum. Perhaps the most noteworthy feature of stage 3 is that alternation is recognized both above and below the tactic pattern of each stratal system. This meant, among other things, that 4 layers of alternation were recognized between the lexeme and the phoneme, where Neo-Bloomfieldian structural linguistics had only 1. Another step taken at this stage was a refinement of the definitions of the realizational relationships, which, except for n-at-axis, were now analyzed as different combinations of the elementary oppositions and vs. Or n upward, toward content, vs. downward, toward expression, as follows: name definition example diversification downward or past ppl /n, ed neutralization upward or past ppl, past tense /ed composite realization downward and second /sekan portmanteau realization upward and 2th/7. 0 realization downward or with 0 as one choice /z, 0. Empty realization upward or with 0 as one choice do, 0/do. This somewhat neater analysis was accompanied by the development of a graphic notation. Here I was influenced by Halliday, and, as its conceptual correlate, the discovery that the whole of the linguistic structure could be represented as a network of relationships, rather than a system of items and their relationships, cf. Helm's Left 1961:22-3. In other words, things like morphons and morphemes are not objects or symbols, although the English language forces us to speak of them in this way, but positions in a network of relationships. But the relational network notation was not used in print till the publications representing Stage 4. Stage 4. Stage 4 might be said to have begun in November 1965, as I was reworking some material for a lecture, with a revision of the model of the stratal system. The basic revision was to put most of the alternations of a stratal system above the tactics rather than just below the tactic pattern. The only instances of diversification left below the tactics in Model 4 were those directly involved in portmanteau realization. The resulting organization of the stratal system may be represented as in Figure 5. Here the morphemic system serves as a typical example and the types of relationships found in each part of the system are indicated by nodes of the relational network notation. The morphemic signs of this model correspond to the realized morphemes of Stage 3, but the morphemes and the morphotactics of Model 4 are at a lower level, i.e., closer to expression, than the basic morphemes and morphotactics of Model 3, because of their position with relation to the morphological alternation. Similarly, the basic lexemes of Model 3 are closer to semens of Model 4 than to Model 4 lexemes. 24. The crooked path of progress in cognitive linguistics Figure 5. Organization of the morphemic system in early Stage 4. Why this difference in the treatment of alternation? As with most revisions, the basic motivation was economy. Diversification above the tactics has the property that the realization chosen in a given instance is that which fits the tactic environment. In other words, the conditioning environments are given by the associated tactic pattern and therefore need not be stated separately. Lamb 1966 B563, Lamb 1966 D55-6. Previously, the statement of conditioning environment had been a structurally significant part of the realization rule. This appears to be a considerable saving. When I found for several instances of diversification in different stratal systems that they could apparently be accounted for more simply above than below the tactics, I proceeded to the conclusion that diversification in general should be treated this way. The only exception was that involving portmanteau realization, for which the conditioning environment was at the same time the other participant in the portmanteau realization, as shown in figure 6, where Th conditions and is conditioned by 2, with the resulting realization second. The other major departure of Model 4 was an increase in the number of stratal systems, from 4 to 6. The additions were, very roughly speaking, at the bottom and the top. This feature of the model was perhaps its main target of criticism, and we can now look back at it as an example of the crookedness of the path of progress in cognitive linguistics. For in this instance the critics were right. How, then, did the model get that way? It was largely a consequence of the hypothesis as to how the stratal system was organized. In particular, Model 4 allowed only one level of diversification, aside from portmanteau realization, and one level of composite realization in the stratal system. When it became evident that one must recognize two levels of alternation in phonology and it also appeared that the tactics of consonant clusters conflicted with syllable tactics, requiring two separate tactic patterns, I concluded that one must recognize two stratal systems in phonology, which could be called phonemic and hypophonemic, Lamb. 1966b, Figure 6. Portmanteau realization in early stage 421 th \j morphemes 12 th morphemic signs at the semological end of the network. Also there was evidence for two separate stratal systems. This was not new evidence, since it had already been partly accounted for in the sememic system of Model 3, which distinguished basic sememes from realized sememes, with a level of alternation intervening, Lamb 1965b. These basic sememes became the hypersememes of stage 4, elements of the hypersememic system, which was set up above the sememic. The resulting 6 stratal systems could conveniently be grouped as 3 pairs of systems, 2 each for semology, grammar, and phonology, but no structural evidence was found for such pairing. It remained a matter of convenience. This early stage 4 model is the one presented in Outline of Stratificational Grammar, Lamb 1966d. Although it was just a preliminary outline, it was published as a small book and was therefore reviewed in the linguistic journals. This occasion provided criticism of the model, some of which was valid, some of which was based on misunderstanding. The most serious defect of the outline was that it was just an outline, it didn't go into detailed explanation or presentation of evidence. Thus the failures of critics to understand some points are largely excusable. But the most serious defects in the model were those which I became aware of on my own and those which were brought to my attention by my co-worker Peter Reich. Minor model changes in stage 4. In 1967 we went through some minor model changes, which corrected some of the more serious defects. One of the problems involved the interconnection of the tactic pattern with the realizational portion of the stratal system. In the outline the connections took the form of the upward ends of the knot pattern, see figure 5, on the grounds that a morpheme connected upwards both to the lexemic stratum and to the morphotactics. The assumption was that the tactic pattern is oriented in the same up and down dimension as the realizational portion. But that assumption turns out not to be valid. Rather, the whole of a tactic pattern is on one and the same realizational level, so it occupies a horizontal plane. It specifies the allowable combinations of elements of a single realizational level. Thus the connection of a morpheme to the morphotactics should be sideways rather than upwards. For this type of connection a new node was invented, called the diamond. 4 types of diamond node are shown in figure 7. As the third of these illustrates, it is possible, in the revised conception, for a line from the higher stratum to go into the midst of a tactic pattern, whereas in the earlier version all realizational connections to the tactics were at the bottom of the tactic pattern. For more on diamonds see Lamb 1970. Figure 7. Types of diamond node. A second infelicity of Model 4, in its original version, involved the sign pattern, which had the form illustrated in Figure 8. It soon became apparent that the limitation to a single level of such patterning within each stratal system was unnecessary and that it entailed uneconomical handling of certain information. The solution was the multi-level sign pattern. Its attractiveness may be illustrated by an example from the lexemic sign pattern for a speaker of English who knows enough about birds to have the lexemes yellow-bellied sapsucker and red-headed woodpecker alongside of the lexemes sapsucker and woodpecker. Figure 9 shows the two analyses. Examples favoring a multi-level sign pattern in the morphemic system are provided by long morphemes such as lobster, dromedary, encyclopedia. Figure 8. Basic form of sign pattern. Emic signs. Figure 9. Lexemic sign patterns: yellow-bellied red-headed sapsucker woodpecker. Now the end nodes in a sign pattern generally correspond to ends of an adjacent tactic pattern. The tactic pattern generates new combinations of elements at its level. The sign pattern contains the fixed or prefabricated items that through repeated use have come to be treated as units. Thus the different levels of a multi-level sign pattern should correspond to the different levels of the associated tactic pattern. Because of this correspondence, one gets a more economical picture of the organization of the linguistic network if one places the sign patterns on a horizontal plane along with the tactic patterns. The treatment of portmanteau realization was also subjected to alternative analysis, primarily in consequence of considerations arising from our work on performance models, in connection with the Linguistic Automation Project. I shall spare you from the details and proceed directly to the punchline, which is Figure 10, an alternative to Figure 6. In this treatment, which is made possible by the conception of the tactic plane as horizontal to the realizational lines and thus intersectable by them in its interior, the portmanteau realization is handled neither below nor above the tactics, but at the tactic level. Above it, shown as at upper left, we have the two lexemes 2 and th \, while just below the tactics, shown as at lower right, we have the single morpheme second, occurring as realization of these two lexemes. The end node in the tactics is the construction for ordinals. The first line leads to numerals, the second to the suffix th. But as the ordered or node provides, if the numeral is 2, the left-hand line is taken instead of the construction, so that the prefabricated ordinal second occurs. For semological examples, see Ikemi 1970. Figure 10. Portmanteau realization in late stage 4-2th. With the removal of portmanteau realization from below the tactic pattern, there would be no occurrence of diversification, downward or, at this level of the stratal system. But at about the same time our attention was drawn to some examples of free variation, and it was apparent that the model of early stage 4 had not properly provided for this phenomenon. The crucial property of free variation is that the alternance can occur in the same tactic environment. For this reason, it is uneconomical to account for such alternation above the tactics, since this would involve two lines from a downward or connecting to a single tactic location. Elementary simplification procedures, LAM 1966 D43-7, shift the downward or to below the tactics, in keeping with the fact that the difference between the two alternants is of no tactic significance. Thus we introduced a subtactic alternation pattern into the stratal system, cf. Bennett 1968. These revisions had been made by the fall of 1967, and they could well have resulted in a new synthesis, which we might call Model V, but I was at the same time aware of additional problems for which new solutions were not so readily forthcoming, and of others for which there seemed to be several alternative solutions, none of which seemed clearly better than the others. Thus from late 1967 till the end of the decade we were without a stable integrated model, since we had no successful synthesis of non-defective hypotheses. The most perplexing of the problems was that there seemed to be needless repetition of diamond nodes for simple lexemes and simple sememes. A simple lexeme is one which connects to a single lexeme rather than to a combination of lexemes. For example, English has the morpheme would. But according to Model 4 it also must have a lexeme would, since this element participates in the lexotactics right along with complex lexemes like woodpecker and yellow-bellied sapsucker. Moreover, the model required that we have sememes for these lexemes, since they played a part in semotactics right along with complex sememes like a stitch in time saves 9. It seemed clear that this was a case of excess surface information. But it was not clear how to eliminate it without getting into some very messy complications. A number of solutions were attempted, one of which was used in a paper I presented at the annual meeting of the Linguistic Society in 1967. But neither this nor the other attempts were fully satisfactory. Another problem area, actually a whole dimension of problems, was that of formalizing the processes of encoding and decoding. This area was the primary concern of the Linguistic Automation Project. The work uncovered more questions than answers but contributed greatly to our understanding not only of these processes but of linguistic structure in general. And then there were suspicions that the model had too many strata. Each of them had been added only when the evidence demanded it, but perhaps some of the evidence could be differently interpreted. Part of the evidence for stratification comes from alternation, and as we approached the end of the decade we found increasing evidence of alternation other than free variation below the tactic pattern, and it appeared that we might be moving toward a refined version of model. This is another illustration of the crookedness of our path, for it became apparent that not all of our earlier revisions had been in the direction of actual progress. Meanwhile, up at the highest levels of the linguistic structure, Gleason and his students were working out principles of discourse analysis from a stratificational point of view. A number of valuable studies have resulted from this effort, e.g. Gleason 1968, Austin 1966, Cromack 1968, Tabor 1966. 3. The current model in late 1970 and early 1971 a new synthesis finally emerged. It resulted from breaking out of some previous conceptions of the organization of the overall network, considered as a series of stratal systems. As mentioned above, the 6 stratal systems of stage 4 had been grouped into 3 pairs, and although this pairing had no structural significance, there was a lurking suspicion that the overall structure did somehow consist of 3 major parts and that future revisions would reveal that the 2 members of each pair did go together. For example, one speculation was that a more complex model of the stratal system would bring the phonemic and hypophonemic systems together into a single stratal system, and that corresponding coalescences could be made for the grammatical and semological pairs. As it turns out, this speculation was partly sound but partly misleading. Continued study of alternation and its interconnections with the tactics and the sign pattern led to a model of the stratal system which comes rather close to that of stage 3. The stratal system in the new model has an alternation pattern both above and below the tactics. But the lower alternation pattern apparently overlaps with the sign pattern, since some alternations can be most economically accounted for in the midst of the sign pattern rather than above or below it. In the morphemic system, for example, this treatment allows us to deal efficiently with alternations among segments of specific morphemes, such as the vowel in do, did, done and the v in have, had, cf. Reich 1968c. Now it is indeed possible to coalesce the former phonemic and hypophonemic systems into a single stratal system. This happy simplification is made possible in part by the new model of the stratal system and in part by a reinterpretation of the evidence which was formerly seen as forcing the recognition of 2 separate tactic patterns in phonology. One is tempted to suppose that the morphemic and lexemic strata might be similarly coalesced, but this possibility does not work out. The essential property of a stratum is its distinctive tactic pattern. Now linguists have long recognized the obvious fact that languages have syllable structure. That is the essence of phonotactics. And if there is anything that is inescapable about linguistic structure, it is that there are such things as prefixes, stems, and suffixes, which combine in characteristic ways to form words. That is the essence of morphotactics. And it is in clear conflict with phonotactics, in that tactic boundaries and constituent structure are different. So there are clearly two separate tactic patterns here. And if there is anything even more widely recognized by linguists of varying persuasions than stems and affixes, it is that clauses come in subjects and predicates. That subjects are, or contain, noun phrases, and predicates are, or contain, verb phrases. That is the essence of lexotactics. And its independence from morphotactics is shown by such conflicts as that in the Queen of England's hat and that in English verb phrases, where, for example, lexemic, 3sg. Perfect passive take. Is realized as morphemic, have z dash, be n plus take n plus with entirely different tactic structure. And I think that most of you in this enlightened audience will agree that there is still another tactic pattern, that at which, instead of subjects and objects, we find agents, goals, instruments, benefactives, datives, and the like. Its independence from lexotactics is clearly shown by such examples as active and passive pairs, which are grossly different at the lexotactic level while almost identical semotactically. Now, what about the hypersememic stratum of stage 4? When we explore it, we find that this stratum has to contain all of the individual's knowledge of his culture, his personal history, his physical environment, in short everything he knows, save the language itself, which is already represented in the lower strata. In other words, one is dealing here with information that lies outside the scope of what is traditionally considered language. And one is dealing with a system of far greater complexity than any of the lower stratal systems, indeed probably more complex than all of them put together. Therefore it seems appropriate to give a special status to this highest level, to consider it as outside the language proper, which does not mean for a moment that the linguist is prohibited from its premises, and to give it a more fitting name than the awkward term hypersemic. Accordingly I now call it the conceptual system, or for those who would like another Greek term, the nostemic system. Its basic units are the nostem and the noston. The noston is an elementary unit of knowledge, and this position in the system corresponds well to its Greek meaning, something which is known. With this revision, the linguistic system proper, according to Model V, has the same four strata that were recognized back in stage 2, sememic, lexemic, morphemic, and phonemic. But there is one further major revision, which amounts to a partial coalescence of the morphemic, lexemic, and sememic systems. It is a solution to the perplexing problem of repetition of diamond nodes for simple lexemes and simple sememes, mentioned above. Related to this problem is the fact that morphotactic classes which are needed to specify the occurrence of morphemes in derivational constructions are often semantically defined. This situation was left unaccounted for in stage 4. It suggests that there must somehow be direct links from morphemes to meaning, bypassing the lexemic and sememic strata. Similar considerations at the lexemic stratum indicate that there must be connections from the conceptual system to the lexemic stratum, bypassing the sememic. Thus one arrives at a scheme in which some points of the conceptual network connect to the sememic stratum, some to the lexemic stratum, some to the morphemic stratum. Now to say only this is not to answer the problem of how we nevertheless account for the participation of morphemes like would in clauses, which are produced in the lexemic and sememic systems. The essence of the solution is a device that may be called the representative, since it functions like a representative in a legislature, who acts for the people he represents, at least in theory, so that their interests are served without their having to be present in the legislature. A representative in the lexemic system is a diamond node which connects into the lexotactics and downward to one or more, viz. downward or, locations in the morphotactics, leading to the morphological forms which it represents, both fixed morphemes and, in some cases, products of productive constructions. Such a representative functions as a single lexeme in the lexotactics, but it connects downward to several or many morphemes, which are distinguished from one another by their different connections to the conceptual system, as well as in part by different morphotactic properties. Thus the morphemic, lexemic, and sememic strata do achieve a partial coalescence in that they share a common inventory of morphemes, while the lexemic and sememic strata also share a common inventory of lexemes, and in that all three are in part directly connected to the conceptual system. According to the current model, then, the linguistic system as a whole, which is distinguishable from, but intricately interconnected with, the conceptual system, consists of two main portions, which could be called phonology and grammar, and the phonology consists of a single stratal system, while the grammar consists of three partially independent stratal systems, whose three separate tactic patterns are concerned with morphology, surface syntax, and deep syntax. Last spring, at the end of my course on language and the brain, in which we had been considering, among other things, various of the uncertainties and unsolved problems of stage 4, I told my students that I would be happy when I knew as much as I thought I knew in 1966. I am now able to report that I am happy. Notes 1. Actually, I believe that this is correct only in part, that there are also other reasons for the differences. But let us concentrate on this one for now. 2. As I have previously pointed out, Lamb 1967, 1966a, Hockett, a neo-Bloomfieldian, and Helmsleth had both advocated the generative aim some years before Chomsky appeared on the scene. 3. I shall now just use the term sentence, to make the discussion applicable to transformational generative grammar as well as, by implication, to any type of generative grammar that would attempt also to generate units of discourse composed of sentences. 4. Cf. Hockett 1961. Hockett considers a solution like that described here, but in the end rejects it. 5. This outline proposed the possibility that languages have 5 strata, but the 4-stratum model was returned to by late 1962. 6. It is true that neo-Bloomfieldians didn't always recognize phonological components, nor did they always systematize the relationships among their units to the degree shown here. But if one performs a logical analysis of their use of the terms and removes inconsistencies, one arrives at this scheme. 7. This paper was published in 1966 but was presented at a conference in 1963 and revised in 1964. 8. Rescriptive phonologists find evidence for more than 2 levels of alternation in phonology, E.G. Chafe 1968, but mutation rules impose their own notational ordering requirements independent of the linguistic structure and therefore cannot be used as a basis for arguing about how much stratificational ordering is needed if one uses a realizational format. Lamb, 1972. 9. 2 approaches were followed in this area. Peter Reich attempted to specify the operation of the nodes by defining each as a finite state machine. A general network processor was constructed for the 7094 computer, using this approach, Reich 1968b. The other approach was to set up models of the internal structure of the nodes, specified by means of more elementary network components. At this more elementary level there are 4 basic node types: the branching, the end junction, the OR junction, and the blocking element, and all lines are one-way. A computer system for testing networks constructed in this system is currently being prepared. 10. In connection with the treatment of alternation, some new network devices, including one-way lines and nodes, have been posited. These and many other matters touched upon here are described in Lockwood, 1972b.